Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Linda, and I'm originally from Michigan, now living in the St. Louis metro area. I'm a college coach with School Match for You and have a daughter at University of Chicago.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince and I will discuss an article that discusses how a growing number of employers don't like to hire Ivy League graduates. For our question from a listener, Haley will answer the question, will college admissions be super competitive in blue states this year because of the election results? And then we start a brand new interview as Linda interviews Ben Neely from Revolution Prep. Ben did a great job explaining the new digital SAT. And if you didn't hear that, I recommend you go to our website and listen to interview number 153. And that's yourcollegeboundkid.com to learn about the new digital SAT and get a feel for Ben Neely. Well, Ben is back to explain the new digital ACT to all of us. And I actually chatted with Ben at the NACAC conference in LA in September, and he told me, all I'm doing these days is traveling around the country, explaining the new digital ACT to students and parents, and there's a lot going on with it, so you're going to want to hear that. And then Kevin Newton is back to continue with part 3 in our series that looks at safe colleges outside of the United States.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Hey friends, Vince is back, but I'll be totally transparent. Vince and I are recording this the same time that we recorded our last segment on the elite schools being accused of bias toward wealthy. Otherwise, I'd ask you, Vince, how the surgery went and all that. But we're still recording this on the same day. Sometimes it's easy when we do recordings to just block out a couple hours and bang out multiple articles. And same for question for a listener. Sometimes we record 3 or 4 at a time. So, but this is another fascinating article. Why don't you give an overview, say the name, and give an overview of this one? This is fascinating.
All right. Thank you, Mark. The bosses who don't care about your Ivy League degree. Elite university pedigrees can work against job seekers in some corners of the corporate world, by Callum Borchers of the Wall Street Journal. So he starts out the article giving an example, Charlie Gripple's financial advisory firm. If you went to the wrong college, and the wrong college is Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. The chief executive of the CGE Financial Group in Iowa says that academic credentials don't impress him like they used to. He worked with many graduates of top-tier colleges in previous jobs at MetLife and ING, where he was vice president, and says they too often, approach clients' challenges like textbook case studies rather than real-world problems. If I were hiring somebody today to be my right-hand person, there's not a chance in heck that that person would come from the Ivy League, says Gripple, who's graduated from the University of Northern Iowa and manages a network of about 500 advisors. Traditionally, a springboard to the top of the resume pile, a degree from a prestigious university, can now prompt questions about the work ethic of the job seekers. The article then goes on to give an example, numerous examples. There's a case of 13 federal judges who signed a letter in May saying they would not hire law clerks who enrolled at Columbia Law School this fall because of how the school handled campus protests. There's also skepticism about the applicants. And this is something that when we just talked about the article in the New York Times, and I found this fascinating when they were doing a discovery of collecting discovery for that particular case, that 43% of the accepted white applicants to Harvard were recruited athletes, children of alumni, donors, faculty, or staff. So that's sort of the person writing the article is saying that sometimes the questions that or the statement that Ivy League means excellence and like flawless, academics, people who are brilliant intellectuals may not be the case because there's all this space set aside for recruited athletes, children of alumni, donors, faculty, or staff. And so you also get a sense from the article that sometimes the students coming from those particular Ivy League institutions may not be prepared in the same way that they used to be in the past. An internal Harvard report last month found that half of the professors and students are afraid to express their views on controversial issues. There's a loss of open dialogue on campus and civil debate that takes some of the shine off of Ivy League credentials. Even sharp Ivy League critics like hedge fund billionaire Bill Ackerman acknowledge the value of alumni networks, and blue chip banks and consulting firms continue to prize graduates of what recruiters call target schools. You're beginning to see some of these blue chip firms. Bain, for instance, has started to look at students who are coming from outside of the Ivy League. They're setting up Zoom meetings. They're allowing the students to be questioned on their potential and their access. The other thing that's come into question, and the article points out, is that if you go to school like Harvard or Yale, that the amount of grade inflation, the number of students receiving A's is over 80%. So what does an A mean if 80% of the people are getting that particular grade? So there's sort of a standard. What's the standard if there's no way to measure it? Some companies like McKinsey, which is a great consulting firm, one of the most successful and important in the world, they're getting around the recruitment and trying to look at different applicants. I think this is a good thing. Students have to solve a problem-solving game. So there are different ways. McKinsey questions the loss of SAT scores because we don't know how to judge them. That piece is missing. And then they also raise the issue about grades. Like if 80% or more of the students are getting A's, then how do we know how strong they are? Although I will say, just as a side note, this weekend I had dinner with a student who's at Stern, sophomore, and he said he felt that the academic program at Stern was excellent, but very very competitive because NYU or Stern, I don't know if it was all of NYU, but Stern had a policy that only 15% could get A or A minus. So everyone, like, to get an A or A minus, they were like doing flips and somersaults and all this extra stuff to make sure that they got those grades, because if you were applying to McKinsey and you had a B plus in, I don't know, calculus or this finance class, that would be enough of a reason for them to say no. So again, he thinks that this particular person that they opened with, the article sort of summarizes his argument by saying that he simply refuses to believe that an Ivy League grads, he thinks that most of them get by through their connections instead of their talent and grit. Based on the article that you will have already heard about, which talks about, your ability to donate, some of that is definitely true. And so now you have firms and places that students are, or jobs that are highly sought after. You have employers looking beyond just the Ivy League, which I think it's good. Like I remember when I worked at a scholarship organization, called the Point Foundation, and they give scholarships to LGBT students. We had a meeting at Johnson and Johnson, and one of the things that surprised me in this particular discussion was that the students who that they were recruiting came from a very, very segmented. They had a list of 30 schools, and if you weren't on that list, you had to know somebody at Johnson and Johnson. But Johnson and Johnson realized that their workers, their high level executives were not diverse, and they were trying to figure out how to get into some other schools. So they were looking at historically Black colleges, Hispanic serving colleges, but in the discussion, in my discussion with them about going to those places, it was kind of clear that they felt like they were like second or third tier in terms of their ability, the students coming from them, and their ability to do good work. It was fascinating to me.
Yeah, this is a fascinating article on a lot of levels. I mean, Vince, I started hearing whisperings of this maybe around 10 years ago, this meaning the backlash against elite schools in hiring. And I'd say about 4 years ago, I really started picking up. And where I started hearing this was from parents in the Silicon Valley
Oh,
who were talking about the backlash. One in particular who I worked with who's like very connected to this hiring world. And she was very adamant about the change that has occurred. And there's a lot of different reasons for it. So in that particular case, she said that people are feeling as if people are coming in and they are entitled and they're not teachable.
hmm,
They're like, they're like impressed with her. They went to school and they're just not coachable and teachable. They'd rather take somebody who's hungry and humble. So there's that angle. I mean, the article specifically talks about the protests. It talks about these 13 law clerks who've said they're not going to look at Columbia grads because they didn't like how Columbia handled the protests. The article talks about wanting kids that have more grit and resilience, and people that have sort of climbed their way up have to show their grit and resilience. There's a Syracuse alum who talked about that. He said, there's a quote, competition prepares people for legal battles. So people that have had to fight their way up demonstrate sort of the personal qualities that are successful.
yeah,
Like you said, the Bain representative said that there's not enough people out there for our need.
yeah,
We've oftentimes said that, like the number of Ivy League grads every year, it's something like 5,800 or something like that. It doesn't even come close to meeting the needs of the workforce. So Bain talked about they've been really happy. They've been reaching out to schools like Santa Clara and Grinnell.
yeah,
People talked about that, and they're happy with what they're seeing, from expanding the places where they would circle from. The article talks about the lack of free speech they feel from the right, on some of these campuses is diminishing the critical thinking skills, and they question whether those are being developed. The article talked about anti-Jewish bias. Here, here's a quote from the article. Ivy League degree used to command respect. Now I get a mixed response. This was a Yale alum who felt like he could drop his Ivy League degree in before, and it was a big deal. And now it's a totally mixed response. There was a discussion with like, what am I supposed to do? Do I not mention it? Like it kind of helps me in certain places, but it hurts me in other places. So I think this is a trend. I mean, because we know right now there's a big backlash against quote unquote wokeism.
hmm,
And people when they think of wokeism, they think of places like the Ivy League and also places like Duke.
yeah,
They think of these as bastions of liberalism. And this is a part of the conservative argument against college. Like, why would I want to go get liberal indoctrination? And so when you think of the epicenter of what people think of liberal indoctrination, these are the schools that they think about. They think they're at the head of the class. So the article talked about there's a little bit of hypocrisy because, like, Trump on one hand will talk about he went to Wharton and then he reaches out and he gets JD Vance, you know what I mean? Who's,
yes,
Yale Law and all that. But then at the same time, you're like bashing elite schools all the time.
right,
So they did talk a little bit about some of the hypocrisy, but I think this is a growing trend.
Yeah.
I had a family that I started working with last year from the main line of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. The son is a senior now, but right at the beginning, when I started working with him, his dad said to me, "No applying to Harvard because I'm not paying for my kid to get brainwashed with that extreme liberal nonsense." A part of me wonders if conservatives have so flooded the zone with this perspective that it almost doesn't matter whether it's true or not. Some people are going to believe it, especially in certain circles. So, at a minimum, there's a perception problem. I could be reading the tea leaves wrong, but the guy in the White House is going to use the bully pulpit, from what I've seen, to target Ivy League schools. He's been crystal clear about wanting to uproot what he calls wokeism, and that has been more defined as diversity, equity, and inclusion, LGBTQ rights, and environmental sustainability initiatives. So I think the Ivy League is in for a bludgeoning over the next few years, and I hope I'm wrong. I think this is a growing trend. And also, if you look at population migrations, right? Like places are growing, are places like Florida and Texas.
Yeah.
And we know how they look at, those East Coast schools. All right. So I think that this is just going to continue to grow. Also, as people expand and open their minds, like you talked about, they're going to find there's talent everywhere.
Yeah. Yes, they are.
There's zero doubt that as they look out, they're going to be like, why weren't we doing this a long time ago? And I don't want to imply to our listeners that everybody's only looking at these schools. It's just, if you look at the people we've been quoting, it's the McKinseys, the Bains, white shoe law firms. Like, these are the places that have been notorious for recruiting from 30 schools.
Right.
It's not most jobs. It's not 99% of jobs. This is like 1% of jobs.
Right.
And that's what the article, New York Times focuses on this a lot because it's their readership. And quite honestly, it gets clicks. But it is fascinating to see how the brand is being damaged. And I don't know if you experienced this, Vince, but I've said this before on the podcast. I had way more people this year for the early decisions, like kids that would have looked at Ivy League schools before are looking at like Duke, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, schools like that.
Yes.
And some of those kids that didn't get in are doing IVs sometimes in regular, which doesn't always make a lot of sense, but that's what they want to do. But it's about that is like not the priority. It's not like I just noticed that, and I don't know, I'm very curious to know how much I'm an outlier versus that's a national trend. It feels to me so clear that it's hard for me to not see some trend there. And then also I see pretty big surges in application numbers at a lot of those other places as well.
Yeah.
Shortly after Vince and I recorded this, I came across this article that ran in the Yale Daily News entitled "International Applications Drop in the First Test Flexible Admission Cycle." And it goes on to talk about how international apps are down 26% compared to last year. Domestic apps are down 8%. Overall, it's a 14% drop in Yale's number of applications. At Brown, in the early decision round, they're down 1,200. And remember, not that many people apply ED. Now, the decision for Yale and Brown to go back to standardized test score requirements certainly played a role. But this is consistent with what I'm experiencing with exceptionally strong students this year. Kids who used to look at the Ivy League are looking at Ivy peers. Last year, the New York Post ran an article on March 29th entitled, "Once Coveted Harvard Degrees Have Been Cheapened. No Wonder Applications Are Down." Now, that was last year, where Harvard had quite a drop in apps. As of this year, Harvard is no longer releasing their admission statistics for the early round. And this is a new Harvard policy that's breaking a 70-year tradition, a 70-year precedent of sharing decisions when they're released early. I think you can read the tea leaves. I highly doubt that they're up. Now, I'm sure a lot of this is jealousy or resentment. Perhaps someone's popping off because their own kid wasn't admitted. But certainly that doesn't explain all of the reaction. I mean, the numbers were up in the Northwesterns, the Notre Dames, like those numbers are up at those places. And when I look at the population trends and then I look at sort of the backlash against wokeism and all of that and liberal indoctrination, I think that the fact that they're hitting the $100,000 price point, there's a backlash against that in a lot of places. I think that I think this was not just an article that was clickbait. Like I think it's substantive. It's substantive that people are questioning why are we like venerating these institutions. Now, these institutions have great history. They have a lot of talent.
Yeah.
They have a lot of connections. They are not dying and they are not going anywhere.
No.
I don't want to oversell it.
Yeah, don't
No?
oversell it.
Yeah, I don't want to oversell it, but there is a shift that's happening out there. Friends, this concludes the first part of my article discussion with Vince. I hope you join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Hillary, we have one of these questions that probably a lot of people would avoid. Feel like you're
Not
walking
us.
into no, we take on all questions. You send them in, we take them on. And Hillary and I were talking before. In some ways, this is a little bit more of a comment, but I felt a lot of other people might be curious if we did answer the simple question, which is it true that, wow, blue states feel like they've hit the lottery now because there are going to be a lot of people not interested in red states? People probably wonder what in the world I'm talking about. Let's play the question.
Yeah.
And then get your comments.
Hey there. I am a frequent listener, a mom of a high school junior and a high school freshman. I wanted to comment on the recent intro to a December episode where Mark was talking about the parent who asked him not to refer their child to any colleges in red states. I mean, I think this is going to be a real thing, and we live in a blue state. My child, my junior and my freshman, have zero interest in going to college in a red state. They can't comprehend why anybody voted for the incoming administration. Let's put it that way. Their whole worldview is oriented to progressive climate, and they're just not going to look at places like Tulane or Clemson or Washington University, all places that we've kind of talked about, thought about, have family friends at. They're not going to do that. And it has nothing to do with me or my husband telling them where they can or can't go. They're just not interested in that. On the flip side, I think this means that college admissions are going to be really competitive a little bit this year, especially next year for the high school class of 2026 for blue state schools, because I think there's a lot of kids all over the country who, Gen Z is just not part of the vibe of the incoming administration, and they want to be places where they can be themselves. So I would expect all, for example, up and down the West Coast to be really competitive, especially for schools like state schools, the CSUs, Oregon State, places that maybe haven't been super competitive in the past. So something to watch. Thanks for the podcast. I'm a frequent listener in my college podcast era.
This was such an interesting comment, and it's something actually that we sort of deal with a lot at Colorado College because we're in a purple state, blue leaning state, but we're in a red city, and so this is something we think about a lot and talk with our students about a lot. I think the other thing before I really get started is that hearing this comment also kind of reminded me of how much we can sort of live in our own bubbles and exist just within a certain bubble. And I think it's important to remember that while lots of students may be turned off from going to red states, there are plenty of students who are also going to be turned off by the thought of going to a blue state, right? They don't want to go to a quote unquote woke state or a woke college. And so they're going to be interested in, heading to Louisiana or heading to Alabama or heading to South Carolina. So I would consider that as you're thinking about this question of like, are Western schools and schools in blue states going to be sort of overrun with applications this year and be made a lot more competitive because of the political environment that we're living in? Well, half of the country is also thinking in the opposite way. So that's going to affect things for sure. The other thing that I was thinking, let me give you some background. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, which, as many know, is quite a liberal area. And I knew that the way that people think in the Bay Area and the kinds of ideas that they're exposed to weren't the only ideas out there. And so I only looked at colleges in the Midwest. My mom was incensed by me not applying to colleges in California. Our family has been there for generations. We have put a lot of time and effort into making California our home, right? Over 5 generations. And she couldn't imagine the idea of leaving, but I wanted to be exposed to ideas that were different than the ones that I'd been around and viewpoints that were different than the ones that I had been around growing up. And so I purposely looked at schools in the Midwest, and I ended up in Ohio. And I'm so thankful that I did, because it gives me a way to understand people who have a perspective that's different from mine, that I don't see in my high school classmates who stayed in California. And now working at Colorado College, I am in a more liberal college environment in a red city. And I have parents from the Northeast asking me all the time, like, is it safe for my kid? And will my student feel comfortable there? And are they going to run into people whose ideas are, way on the other side of the spectrum in terms of their political views? And like, your kid is going to feel safe here. And also there are opportunities to engage with people who have different points of view. And if you don't get that in college, when are you going to get it? Right. And so I encourage students all the time when I talk about this, to think sort of outside of just being around people who make them feel comfortable. And especially for students who sort of have the privilege of being, in the majority. So you're a white, hetero, cisgender student, you can go anywhere and not feel threatened. And you can have the opportunity to understand and learn about people who have thoughts and ideas that are different from your own. And I think that's a pretty amazing opportunity. So I wouldn't discount that also. Not that I know that this caller said, our student is doing this on their own. They're not thinking about what mom and dad, we're not trying to push them in one direction or another, and that's fine. But I also think that when you have the opportunity to counsel your students, talking with them about where would you be comfortable and be able to sort of learn something about people who are different from you, that's a pretty neat opportunity also.
Yeah, you said a lot of things that I wanted to say. One of the first thought I wrote down was just in general, people tend to have people in their peer group that tend to be like them. And that applies to a lot of things. Generally, people's peer groups are usually somewhat similar to where they're at socioeconomically. There's a lot of homogeneity around race. And another area is politics. So much so that people that are ensconced in red states don't even know the blue state world, and people in the blue state world oftentimes don't know the red state world. And I'll give an example of this. So both my daughters live in Durham, so North Carolina's a purple state, but that the research triangle is much more, it's probably about 70-75% blue, and they're both in education, so they're more in blue circles. So my youngest daughter graduated from the University of Georgia, and so one of the things that she's like hardcore football, and one of the things she often does is either throw a big party for every Georgia game, or they travel. They have a traveling peer group. So 2 of the last 3 years they've gone to Knoxville, Tennessee, and they're not dropping $1,000 on these tickets or whatever. But what they do, they literally go to a sports bar, and they go to this place, 55-foot screen, and they're there this year. They went to see the Alabama-Tennessee game because one of her really good friends is an Alabama grad. So when the game was on, this is like, election buildup. So commercials start coming on, for Kamala Harris, TV commercials. And Joy was telling me that they're in a bar, like people were jumping up and they were like, F Harris, like, yelling it. And she was like, and the thing that was so shocking is it was coming like from both sides. It was the Tennessee fans and the Alabama. And
Wow.
the reason I bring that up is like, that's like not her world.
Yeah.
So it was very startling for her to see that. And it really is true that the country's, pretty close to evenly divided. I mean, one of the reasons a lot of the Southern schools flourished during COVID was because people didn't like what were perceived as restrictive mask policies in bluer
Yeah.
states. And a lot of the red or purple states, they had a real surge during that. And I've had 2 interviews on my podcast where I've explored why Southern schools have grown so much with experts, and one of them even mentioned that, like our policies toward COVID were very inviting to a lot of people and welcoming. So it's hard to know that there's that other world out there if you're not ensconced in that. So that's one thought that I had on this topic, because I don't think, and I think I'm sure you'd agree with this, Hillary. Admission officers in blue states are not under the impression that, oh my goodness, we're about to hit the lottery this year because
Yeah,
of
I haven't heard that.
yeah, I haven't heard that as well, because it kind of almost balances itself out. The other thing, and on our intake questionnaire, we do have several questions about politics, and the reason we have them is because it is very important to some people. And we do get people that say, like, I don't want to be around any Trumpers, or the other extreme. Like, especially during COVID, there was a lot of that. There better not be any mask mandates, and nobody better be teaching critical race theory. Like, we would see these type of things that would show up. Sometimes on the right, the single biggest issue they will identify that they care about is transgender sports. It's like their top issue. That will come up. There's a lot of talk about about wokeism, like you said. So we know that those sides are out there. So we ask those questions just to see, is this important to you? Because if it's important, we'll take that into consideration in building your college list. But there are so many people for whom, even if they lean blue or lean red, it's just not one of their top 5 issues when it comes to picking a college. Like, there are a lot of people that will respond like, I don't really care about that. It's, it's just not in the forefront of their mind of what they think about. So that's another reason why I don't think there's going to be this bonanza for blue states, is because even for a lot of people that may vote Democrat, that's not necessarily like a top 5 issue for them when it comes to picking a college.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to say is, I think it's important on the left to understand the gradations of people on the right. It's not sort of just the right, everybody's storming the Capitol and wanting to like deport every immigrant. There are also people that lean Republican, but they're not MAGA.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to kind of make that distinction. And the last thought I have is, in general, young people lean more Democratic. So you take a state like Alabama that's gone like 35% for Trump. Do you know that in both Tuscaloosa and Auburn, there were more blue votes than red votes?
Yeah. I was going to say that too. Like, college campuses
Yes.
are sort of a bit of a bubble in and of themselves, right? That most schools outside of the Liberty, Hillsdale, Grand Canyon, most schools are going to lean further to the left than their surrounding city.
And it's true with the professors too.
Yeah.
Both the professors and the young people. So that's another reason why I don't think, even someone that's blue leaning oftentimes is open to a school in a red state, because the people they're around, it's not like so extreme where they feel like their voice is silenced, or whether you feel like they can't find their people.
Yeah. And that's not to say that, universities in red states are blue, because that's not true either. They're just a little bit, I think they're more moderate than the state around them or the city around them.
Now, there is something I do want to acknowledge what the caller said, because she was referencing me referring to what someone told me, a Virginia family that told me
Mm-hmm.
she's very concerned about this trend. There is something to be said for the power that public schools have. I mean, when you look at the policies that DeSantis has put in place in Florida,
Yes.
it's
I
basically
think Florida.
yes,
Florida is the perfect example, right? Like, if you
right.
care about learning about history from the broadest possible perspective, and that's important to you, then you shouldn't go to college in Florida, because you're not going to learn everything, because they've pulled that out of their curriculum. They've made it illegal, right? So, or they are making it illegal. So that I certainly can understand. But I think that's also sort of a different question from the are students going to flock to blue states because they don't want to go to college in a red state. I think they're related, but two sort of different things.
Hmm. But I understand that fear, and it's also there are other
Yeah.
states trying to mimic Florida too. Like there's people out there trying to compete and see who can be the most anti-woke. And there's a lot of the policies that Florida's put in place. Look at the anti-DEI initiatives; they're spreading
Hmm.
rapidly and
Absolutely.
very quickly.
Yep.
So I just want to say that because I don't want the caller to feel like we're saying she needs to change her thinking.
Discounting.
Like, yeah,
Yeah.
like there like I totally agree with a lot of what you said, Hillary. Like you're gonna learn if you don't necessarily surround yourself with people who think just like you. But there is such a thing as an environment that's so extreme from who I am and what I believe that I wouldn't be comfortable there.
Absolutely.
And that shouldn't be discounted either.
Yes, and it depends on who you are and your identity, right? And if your
Yeah.
identity is one that is safe in places that are very far red, right leaning, that's very different from someone who wouldn't feel safe in those environments. In fact, at CC, we have a transfer program called Haven, where we sort of make the transfer process easier from students coming from states where there's anti DEI legislation, because we know that they might feel threatened in those places, and we want them to have a place where they can learn without feeling like they're on edge all the time. And at the same time, I think there's something to be said for being a person whose identity is not threatened in those places, and being able to go in and have not just learn from the people around you, but also influence the people around you, because you're in a privileged position where you can have influence. And not that that is everyone's responsibility, but if this is something that's important to you, then not talking about the caller necessarily and her students, but anyone who's listening, like, if that matters to your kiddo, then maybe they would do well in a place where there's actually some friction that they encounter, and there's something to advocate for, versus being a far left leaning person and going into a far left leaning environment. There are still social justice things to do in those environments, but wow, you could probably make a bigger impact in a place where more work needs to be done.
Yeah, and there's just another thought I have. I don't know how this will flesh out, but perception's reality. There's some thinking that I'm going to say the president-elect, who will be the president by the time we air this, Hillary and I are sitting here recording this on January 13th, that in the past, in his first regime, he tended to be favorably disposed toward people that liked him. I mean, he was very clear about that. And so there could be a thinking on the part of some that are blue states going to be a target in a way that might, you know, impact their resources or impact their opportunities because, hey, you didn't vote for me and I'm going to take care of the people that voted for me. Like, I don't see that necessarily coming into people's mindset, psyche when it comes to college. I'm just bringing up the point that this is very complex, the topic, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of different nuances that come into play. But I mean, her and I agree, and she's in college admissions. Like, she's not hearing that from everybody. Like, oh my goodness, we better get ready for the surge this year in applications just strictly because of all the people that will be interested in who will be eliminating red states for political reasons. I just think it ends up being pretty close to a wash.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Thanks, Hillary.
Yeah, thank you.
You see, friends, we don't back away from anything. You send
Nope.
it, we take on all questions.
He
So
picked the
much
right
for the
co-host today.
friends. Because of the generosity of Rob Franek and Princeton Review, Chris from Minnesota, who sent in our first question after episode 500, that was on episode 501, and the anonymous listener who sent in the question that Hillary and I just discussed, are going to get your choice of one of 4 books. So you can either have the Best 390 Colleges 2025 version by Rob Franek, David Soto, Stephen Koch, and Aaron Riccio. You can also have College Admissions 101 3rd edition, also by Rob Franek. You can have Essays That Kicked Apps, 55 Unforgettable College Application Essays that got students accepted by the Princeton Review. Or you can have the Princeton Review's Digital SAT Prep 2025 Guide. So just email me directly at mark@schoolmatch4u. So that's mark@schoolmatch4u.com, and let me know the book that you want. This week, we finally finalized our process of how this is going to work. So you need to reach out to me if we take your question on the air, and then I will send your address and name to Jeannie Cryer, who's the publicist at Princeton Review, and they'll send out the book directly to you. But I'm not going to go chasing after people. So if you want one of these books, either for yourself or for a gift for somebody else, just reach out and we'll get you the book. And once again, I want to thank the generosity of the Princeton Review. They've given us enough books for almost 2 years.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, the name Ben Neely is familiar to you. It's because Linda interviewed Ben in December of 2023 on the new digital SAT. Well, guess what? Ben's back for an interview on the new digital ACT. And I know very few people that combine Ben's knowledge of these tests with great communication skills and a real great personable personality. So in part 1, which will be a 3-part interview, Ben shares his role at Revolution Prep. Ben shares why the ACT has decided to go digital. Ben shares some of the reason he believes the ACT has gone digital, that the ACT will never let you know, but he's going to let you know. Ben shares the timeline of when the ACT is going digital. Ben explains what he means by a live beta test. Ben explains what the ACT is doing about the science section. Ben explains why the ACT is a linear test and not an adaptive test like the digital SAT. And finally, Ben explains how the ACT platform differs from the SAT platform. Listen and enjoy.
This is Linda, and I'm thrilled to be talking today with returning guest Ben Neely from Revolution Prep. And as a reminder, Ben is the Chief Research and Impact Officer at Revolution Prep, and he was on the podcast about a year or so ago talking about the digital SAT. So it seems natural that we would bring him back to talk about the upcoming digital ACT. Ben, welcome. And if you would please briefly remind our listeners about your role at Revolution Prep and what you've been doing the past year and why we keep bringing you back to talk about these tests.
Well, I might, thank you, Linda. I might let you answer the last of those parts, but I can certainly answer the first few. So yeah, in my role as Chief Research and Impact Officer, I am lucky enough to be able to learn a lot and research a lot. I get a chance to collaborate with experts in the field of standardized testing, and I would say college admissions in general, whether that's college counselors or folks working in higher ed, in enrollment management or admissions. And I'm able to travel to conferences all over the country. There's quite a bit of travel involved. And through that, I'm able to soak up hopefully lots of really useful information that I can then bring to students, their parents, educators, counselors, that helps everybody make their best decisions. So that's a fairly vague description, but it involves a lot of airplanes and hotel rooms and podcast interviews. So I'm really grateful that your college bound kid has invited me back on.
We're glad you're here because there are a lot of questions out there about this digital ACT because it does not look like the digital SAT. So to begin, tell me, why do you think, or is there a real answer, the ACT has decided to reformat things and go digital?
So I'll give you a couple different answers to that. One would be a synopsis of how ACT is answering that question themselves, at least in terms of their public communication, and then I'll give you my my beliefs about what they're actually doing.
Good.
So they have, as I think most of these test makers do, they do a fair amount of student and educator surveying. So they solicit input and feedback pretty continually. And the main things that they have cited in terms of needing to make a change are the test is too long, that students need more time, especially more time per question. They don't like feeling rushed on standardized tests, so they want to address that. They have noted that some students, and perhaps the majority of students, find the science section to be their least favorite section of the ACT. And then I think the other sort of rationale behind any potential change is that there are some students, in their view, who still want to be able to test on pencil and paper. So whatever changes they make, they needed to keep that in mind, that they wanted to preserve that pencil and paper. So those are their surface level stated reasons for making a change. I will say the rationale that they're not putting out there, and I totally get it, I wouldn't do it either if I were them, is that they're struggling. I think they have seen a really significant hit to their retail student test taker base over these last couple of years. And it's not rocket science to connect that to the new SAT format, which is about 30% shorter, as we discussed last time. It's on a computer. They've shortened the reading passages. There have been a number of changes there, which are surgically designed to be more appealing to a teenage test taker. And I think ACT has really seen a significant market shift and a decline in their share of the students choosing between these two tests. Even in parts of the country like the Midwest, where they've traditionally been very strong, they're seeing an erosion of that test taker base. So I think that's the real reason they're feeling compelled to make a change, is their need to survive as an organization and have their test be more appealing or less unappealing to test takers. Probably a better way to phrase it.
Right. Talk about timeline. When is this all supposed to happen?
So we just found out this news in July, supposedly behind the scenes. Obviously, they've been planning for a lot longer and communicating with potential partners in higher ed, but the public just found out in the middle of July. And this new test kicks in April of 2025. Now, and I'll come back to this later as we try to dig into more parts of this discussion, but I will note that unlike the SAT switchover, where when they switched, it was March of this past year, March of 24, that was a hard switchover, meaning they had one format before then, and then once that test date came, you had no choices. ACT is doing what I would describe more as like a live beta test. So it's the real new test, but from April through the July test dates in 2025. I do think availability is going to be very limited for this new test. And so I think that's an important distinction for any counselors or families that are comparing this to the SAT change. The SAT went live with their real operational test. I think in this case, you have ACT, testing the waters a little bit in terms of implementation and test delivery. So it's not quite the same as far as their timeline. So April for the first instance of this new test, and then September of 2025 is what I would characterize as the wide release of this new test. So in September of 25, there will be availability in the pencil and paper format, whereas before then it's only going to be in digital for this new test. And that will also be when I would expect most students to have better access to a testing site in general, is September of 2025.
So in April, theoretically, the digital goes live, and they also can do the paper. Will the paper test be the new test, or
No, not in April. Not in April. Yeah. So this is where things get really confusing. And obviously this is in podcast format. So I'm going to do my best to use words when probably some kind of, flowchart would be the better learning aid here. So in April, there will be both digital and paper versions of the ACT, but For paper, it will only be the current or classic version of the ACT. So in April, when the new ACT, so I'll probably use new and classic as my two terms. So when the new ACT launches in April, it will only be in digital format for the April test date on through the July test date. And then in September, the new ACT starts up in paper. So for that April through July timeframe, students will have what I might describe as almost too much choice. Theoretically, they'll have a lot of different ways to take this test. They can take it in digital, and actually, there is already some availability for a digital ACT for the classic ACT. They rolled that out in February of 2024. So, if you do all of the math, there are theoretically 12 different ways to take the ACT between April and July of next year. But before we get kind of too hung up on, oh, that's so many options, the digital versions of this test, whether it's the digital new ACT or the digital classic ACT, are almost non-existent. It is really something that is only available at a tiny number of testing sites across the United States, such that the vast majority of folks who are hearing this right now will not be able to take that test between now and July of next year. They are working on making some changes that will make that more available. But before we get too hung up on 12 ways, I think the reality is it's just mostly not going to be available. Between now and next July, it's going to be classic pencil and paper ACT that students will actually be able to find seats for.
Okay, so students don't need to start freaking out quite yet
No.
about that. Okay, that's good because I've talked to some parents who are a little, well, it's confusing. I mean, I'll just say that
It
it's
really is.
really confusing. Um, and one of the things that's so confusing is what's happening with the science section. I mean, talk about that.
Yeah. So science section has always been a little bit of an interesting section relative to the broader scope of ACT and SAT, in that it is the one area that to some extent departs pretty significantly from the content domains or the knowledge domains that are covered between both tests, right? So both tests have a lot of similarity around what they're measuring in math, in reading, in grammar or conventions of written English. Like there's a lot of overlap in what's being assessed there. The science section does have some similarities on the SAT in some of the questions, but on ACT, you have this dedicated section that is basically lab reports of some type where students need to put on their data analysis brain, their ability to infer, sort of changes in phenomena that are being observed by this sort of lab report, read charts and graphs, and then interpret them in terms of what is actually happening. And just to be totally clear, they don't need to demonstrate any knowledge or achievement in specific domains of science knowledge, right? Like biology or physics or chemistry. None of that is being assessed. And this, has always, I think, sort of stood out for students. ACT themselves has cited this, that for a lot of students, this is one of the less comfortable sections, whether it's because as a student, they're not as aligned with STEM type subjects, or because it just doesn't look like a typical kind of math question or reading question or, English grammar question. And so the main change that's coming, and this I suspect we're going to start digging into this new ACT, is they are making that science section optional, right? So currently on the classic ACT and all the way through next July, 4 different sections: reading, math, English, and science, all required. So if you go take the ACT, you must take all 4 of those sections, and they all effectively get averaged into a composite score, the sub-scores for each of those sections, 1 through 36. Starting with the new ACT, again, in April, theoretically, although you won't be able to really get it until September of next year, you will be able to choose as a student whether or not you want to take the science section. And they are really going to be putting forth that the core of this new ACT does not include science. It's math, reading, and English sections, and then the optional science section on top. And that is, I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons they're saying they want to make this change is to offer a shorter test that compares more with the length of the SAT. This is their primary means for doing that. They're saying, if you just don't take a part of the test. Suddenly it will be shorter than the SAT by about 10 minutes. And that's a very different approach than SAT, which said we're going to do very, very similar types of questions. We're just going to use digital adaptive test design to shorten the test without sacrificing validity. ACT is saying, we're just going to give you the chance to chop part of the test off entirely and take a linear test that is just shorter.
So let's talk about some of those differences between the ACT and SAT. First, SAT, one of the big things was adaptive testing. Is that a thing with ACT?
It is not. So their internal philosophy, or I guess ethos around format, leans towards continuing to offer the pencil and paper version of their test, the ACT. For, they haven't committed to this for a generation, but I was at a conference in Nashville that they host a couple of years ago, and they said at least 5 years, 2 years ago. And I've been fortunate enough to have recent conversations with one of the product leaders at ACT, and this ACT representative committed to the same thing, that for the foreseeable future, they want to offer pencil and paper. Their take is that there continues to be a digital divide in the United States, where certain students have more access, more familiarity, more training with computers than others. So for them, it is important as an organization to have this pencil and paper. And if you're going to have pencil and paper, it makes adaptive effectively impossible, right? You can imagine a funny scenario where the proctor is like switching out which paper test you get as you take it and grading it in real time. But realistically, that's just not going to happen. So that means they can't do adaptive, whether it's their digital test platform or whether it's pencil and paper. It will be linear. So students are just going to get what they get. That set of questions is predetermined before they click start or before they turn the first page of their booklet, and there won't be any real-time adapting of test difficulty like there is on the SAT.
So has that been an issue with the SAT, the digital divide? Have we seen students who haven't been able to take it?
It's interesting that you asked that. I don't have any research at my fingertips that's been done. Obviously, this test is new. I would say anecdotally, it does not seem to have been a widespread issue, even in communities that are challenged more with poverty. I think there were obviously a lot of terrible things that happened as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but one of the maybe silver linings was some pretty substantial funding went towards digital device support, at public school districts all over the country, where I think I used to work in a division of our company that built software platforms in the, let's say 2013, 2014, was not uncommon then to go to schools or school districts where they just wasn't device access for students. I think fast forward now to 2024, that is much more rare of an issue, whether it's Chromebooks that are, sent home with students or kept in the school. I think that's much less of a concern from just basic access. Now, I think there is still a valid point to be made about the differences in terms of privilege for certain students or certain households where they've had access to computers from a young age, or don't just have access at school or at the library, but have access at home. I will say the nature of the SAT's test platform is not super complex. I think it does not necessarily benefit as much a student that has deep familiarity with technology. So I think it's pretty fair overall. So I'm not discounting ACT's concerns. I also know that ACT traditionally, and they have some sort of roots in this regard, has been a test that has been focused on serving all U.S. students, including those in maybe more rural areas, right? And so I think that is a whole other sort of, then you start to get into some even connectivity issues around internet access and so forth. So I think that's a lot of what drives their sentiment. I will also say, and this is fine, but this is not something I've heard from ACT, but I believe part of their desire to continue with pencil and paper is to have a market differentiator from SAT, right? To be able to say, hey, they only do digital. We're offering more choice. We're giving students digital, or they can still do pencil and paper, to sort of, again, that gives them, I think, some nominal marketing benefit in the marketplace to be able to distinguish themselves from the College Board.
Yeah. How does the ACT platform differ from SAT?
So this is a tricky question to answer, and I've learned a lot more about this based on the recent conversations I've been able to have with ACT directly. I got to give you a little bit of backstory. So ACT has a pretty significant presence in Asia. That is a market for them where they've really expanded pretty significantly and being able to offer assessments, whether it is for college readiness or whether it's for more of a yearly standardized test to measure progress and achievement. And as you probably know, in a country like China, there are really significant restrictions on internet access. The phrase "the Great Firewall" gets thrown around to refer to some of that restriction, where you can't access some things like Google and so forth. So that is where what has driven a lot of ACT's design decisions around their digital test is actually that was the first market they really pursued. So as a result, ACT's digital testing right now, and this is really different than SAT. So with SAT, just to jump there, students bring their own computer. They download an app. It's called Blue Book. And then when it's time for testing, that app connects to the internet, goes to the cloud, as it were, and it connects to College Board servers, it authenticates, and then it securely retrieves the test onto their own laptop. Because of that, Great Firewall issue in China, ACT's current digital experience requires that the testing site has their own local server hardware and provides the devices to hook up to that for the students who test. So if you currently go to take a digital ACT, you are not bringing your own computer. The site has to have the computer, and it is locally networked to a secure server. And that is, suffice it to say, a lot more complicated of a solution that was really forced upon them by those restrictions in China. And so I'm coming back now the long way to answer your question, which is what does that testing interface look like, or how does it work? It is in flux. So ACT realizes that for the broader US market, they need to move to the same kind of setup that the SAT has, where kids bring their own devices. I mentioned earlier that even though this new ACT comes out in April, students really won't be able to find a test site from April through July. That's because they're still going to be stuck on this other format that basically no school wants to do, right? If you go to a school and say, hey, we'd love you to host digital ACT, you need to provide the server and the hardware, and it'll be all on you if any of those devices break. Nobody wants to do that. So they're working on changing that. They don't have a stated timeline yet. So I couldn't even get out of them. Is that going to be April? Is it going to be July? But I know they're working hard on changing that sooner rather than later. As soon as they do, I think we can expect more test site availability. But this is actually going to be a different test platform than what they are currently doing for digital ACT. It's being developed by a different software vendor, and a lot of the specifications, will there be a graphing calculator like Desmos for SAT or anything else? A lot of that is not yet finalized. So they're literally in the midst of finalizing those specifications right now. So that was a lot of words for me to say. I don't know the answer to your question, but hopefully it gives you some background on why this is so in flux. But we should learn more, I would say, quite soon in the next 30 to 60 days, in December and January.
Friends, this concludes part 1 of Linda's interview with Ben Neely. Hope you'll join us next week for part 2 of 3.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, hopefully you've enjoyed my interview or conversation really with Kevin Newtons on safe universities outside of North America. We'll now continue with part 3 of 4.
So yeah, I think it's important that for this conversation that you're kind of comparing to U.S., not within because I don't want to create like an unrealistic standard. Obviously, some places will always be safer than others or whatever, but I'm thinking of the American that says safety is very important to me. I want a place that feels safe, even if it's maybe not the safest within the international options. But compared to most of your U.S. options, especially if you want to be in a city or small city or whatever, the statistics and my experience is this is better probabilities. Obviously you can't guarantee some random person, so you can only speak in terms of probabilities. You can't do guarantees, but we get that. Yeah.
It's like I tell everyone I work with, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see the future. But across the board, the places we've mentioned as being safer are safer. You know, I don't want to capitalize on people's fears because I think that's a really unethical thing to do. And also, it just, even if it were unethical, it makes me feel like a dirtbag. But I think that, when we look at the kinds of crime reports we see out of even the East End of London, which has a thriving student community. I mean, Queen Mary University of London is there. It's one of my absolute favorite universities for the right kind of student. But there are some students who will go to Queen Mary and think, this isn't for me. And then they go to, Royal Holloway or UCL, and they're thinking, actually, this is great. And, there are things other than crime at play there. There's socioeconomic concerns. There's, that a friend of mine is a sociologist, and she would have an absolute field day with this conversation. And, she's a lot more better suited to discuss it in more sensitive terms than I am, I feel. But I do think that, I'm just going to come out and say it, with regards to crime, the typical places you're going to be drawn to for most people, which are the UK, Canada, Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and major cities in Europe, and really the whole of Scandinavia and the Netherlands, they're going to be safer.
Mm-hmm.
So I hate to paint with such a broad brush. Yeah, you're going to see less crime at a small liberal arts school in the middle of nowhere than you're going to see at, a massive 40,000 person university in the middle of Madrid or in the middle of Amsterdam. But that does start to get to be things like student body size and just things that are a little bit beyond. But on the whole, I would say that if you are concerned about the crime aspects, overseas makes sense. If you're concerned about the political risk aspects, we don't want you going to Taiwan. We probably don't want you going to South Korea right now, which hurts me to say because there's some great programs in South Korea. We definitely don't want you going to, Jordan or Lebanon or someplace like that. And again, I learned Arabic at the University of Jordan. I love that place. If anyone comes to me and asks, where do I need to go to learn Arabic? We are putting a 700-mile exclusionary zone around the Levant and thinking, maybe you should go to someplace like Oman. Maybe you should go to Morocco. And it's just because I hate to reduce it to this, but better safe than sorry. I don't want anyone's kid or anyone to have to be evacuated in, in the midst of smoke and fire and anything like that. Like, yeah, it's a really cool story for my buddy. It would not be a cool story for me to have as somebody who worked with a student.
What about people, and you brought this up earlier, they're not happy with the U.S. election, and they are interested in a different environment politically? What are the places that you either stay away from or embrace? And if it's the same places, that's okay. But I just wanted to address it because you're doing what I was hoping you would do, which is take a multifaceted approach to safety. You're talking about, physical safety, and you're even breaking that down into war zones versus crime, and then you're also talking about, for lack of a better word, safety for populations that are non-majority populations and are sometimes marginalized. So that could be, like you said, race, gender, sexual orientation, just to name a few. Could even get into social economics as another lens to look at that through. But then there's this other aspect of safety, which is political safety, being around people who may, be similar to my worldview on that, or at least the direction that things are going are not different from what I'm hoping they'll go. Somebody, I know people are coming to you on that, because if they're coming to me asking me about it, then they're coming to you, right? So when they come to you and that component of safety is very important to them, where do you tend to say, well, you may not want to go here?
Right. I think, we even have to break it down a little bit according to which of those populations, because like I mentioned earlier, the UK has historically been absolutely great to LGBTQ people, but not necessarily trans people. They're working through that. I think they're getting better. But it's again, if you're coming from here in Texas, it could very well be an improvement. If you're coming from Berkeley, California, since we alluded to them earlier, it depends on where you end up. If you're in London, you're going to do just fine. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, maybe not so much. But I think the one thing that's worth mentioning in light of that, because there is this overarching theme, this concern about the election, concern about what comes next, is we can't just look at it in terms of the absolutes of where you feel safe while you're at university, because we have this problem that presidential terms are 4 years, and most degrees outside the US, except in Ireland, Scotland, and Canada, are 3 years. So we also have to look at it in terms of where can you most easily stick around for another year. If it's to do a master's degree, that's great. That makes it easy. If it's not to do a master's degree, where's going to be pretty good about the work permits? So, and where's honestly going to be good about international students? So I'm
curious. You stimulated a question for me. I can think of two types of people that may be very concerned about the direction the United States is going, and they reach out to you. One is, I think I'd like to live in another place. So let me go to college there. I'd like to live there. And then there's the one that you were describing more recently, which is I'd like to take a 4-year pause, maybe not be here with what I think may be some chaos that I don't feel like dealing with, and sort of watch and sort of see what direction the U.S. goes. Are most of your people in the latter category, which is, I just don't think I want to be here for the next 4 years, but I want to come back, versus, I think I might want to live somewhere else, so let me get oriented to another country now and start to transition to another place I think I may want to live, or I'm assuming you're probably hearing from both.
It's really people want to keep their options open is what I'm getting most of. So I brought up the 3-year versus 4-year thing just because people are now starting to see, in the past, you really had to want to go to Edinburgh or St. Andrews or Trinity College or UBC or U of T to justify that extra year in a lot of people's minds, because, go to wherever for 3 years and sunk cost and all those things that my economist friends have a lot of fun explaining to me. Well, they're getting vengeance for me getting into the geopolitics of the Middle East over the Thanksgiving dinner table. But it's admittedly people who I think want to leave their options open. So something that, I was talking with 2 Australian university reps yesterday, and they were very clear that, hey, we offer a number of visas for our graduates. What does this kind of look like for them? And it's just, there's something to be said about keep this sheer number of people wanting to leave their options open, and just, again, I think I found something really telling. I was talking to one of my grad students the other day. She's applying for graduate programs, and the plan was originally for her to take a 1-year leave of absence, do a 1-year master's degree, and then make up her mind if she wanted to come back or if she wanted to stay. And from some things she said, she's shifted her view on that. She's thinking more of an extended period abroad. Now, I do not know this person's political beliefs. It's none of my business. But it is something that I think even people who are more guarded about it are definitely looking at it and being like, let me make sure I can have my hand on the door, just so that if I do need to step out or if I do need to stay out, I was talking, like I said, to the Australian admissions reps, and we're recording this a few days before Thanksgiving, and they were saying that we're seeing a small but significant bump in our Term 1 applications, which for most Australian universities end around Thanksgiving. So I'm sorry, we're just now stating this. That's on me, Mark. That's not on you.
It's okay.
But that they're seeing people who are thinking, we start classes in February. They can get out in February. And, one university in particular I know has streamlined their transfer policies so that students can come in, and as long as they complete 2 years, they're pretty, they can still have access to those visas. They still get the degree from James Cook University. It's absolutely paradise. It's on the Great Barrier Reef. It's a great place to be.
I was going to ask you a question. I think you probably just answered it there for me, which is, to what degree do you find these international schools are cognizant of the U.S. politics could potentially lead to an influx in more applications for them? Is that something on their conscious radar?
Absolutely. I can tell you that I have been in contact with 50%, and that is not an exaggeration, of the universities in New Zealand in the last 48 hours.
Wow.
Granted, there are only 8 universities in New Zealand.
Still,
but,
4 in 48 hours is pretty good, Kev.
And I've not been the one initiating conversations. It's just like, what can we do to help support your students? On the whole, I think it was, I could be mistaking my Canadian prime ministers, but I think it was Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, who said, having a border with America is like sleeping next to a bear. You feel every shift. And that's how these other universities representatives are incredibly cognizant. Even places that you might not first think of, that they've got an eye on the election. It has been for the past 2.5 weeks, it has been the one thing that, we've talked about.
Friends, this concludes part 3 of 4 of the series Kev is doing on us of safe universities outside the country. We hope you join us next week for the final part. Friends, on Monday's episode, Hillary and I are going to do a real deep dive on a QFL that came in from SpeakPipe from a listener who in essence asks, what do I get actually if I pay top dollar for a pricey, fancy designer elite school? Is it worth it besides the prestige? So we answered this question for about 45, maybe even 50 minutes. So we'll run that as a 1-parter and a 2-parter over the next 2 Mondays. And then we'll have part 2 of 3, Dean Christoph Gutentag's interview on understanding how Duke admissions makes decisions. And friends, I close you out today with a quote from Helen Keller. Helen Keller said this: when one door of happiness closes, another one opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. I got to read that again. When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. Words of wisdom from Helen Keller. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.